So delighted to have you here, Adam Kramer and Angie Koch. Take it away.
Yeah, so I'm Adam. I work at the Working Center and have run or helped run their urban agriculture projects for 10, 11 years now. I guess maybe some of you know a little bit about the Working Center or have maybe interacted with the garden or looked at our website, as I encourage you to do. So we're, a volunteer-driven community project. It's, we're very much centered around connecting people to each other and to work and to land and to food. So it's very much like a teaching space, and we grow a lot of vegetables, but in a way that's almost secondary. That's the means through which we build community and help people learn to grow their own food and have fun doing it. So we kind of function as an open community space where anyone can come and join in the work of supporting a community project like that. I do have some slides I could throw up since Angie said she's got slides. I just thought this will just give you a bit of context with the Working Center. It sounds like a lot of you are really interested in kind of the community side of things, and so I can just give a brief kind of overview of what the Working Center does. So the Working Center was founded in 1982, and it's really through much of that time it's been centered on being kind of an array of productive communities. So the cafes and the bike shops and which we kind of lump together in what we call community tools projects. So the garden is one of them. Recycle Cycles bike shop, Worth a Second Look. There's an art space. Much of this is centered around downtown Kitchener. So, Job Search Resource Center is downtown on Queen Street. St. John's Kitchen is a community kitchen that, serves, I don't know what the current numbers are, but I'm sure it's thousands of meals per week. And that has undergone a huge expansion since in the last 2 years since COVID. Housing is another big one. The Working Center operates a great many housing initiatives that incorporate, addiction supports and all sorts of community supports centered around housing. So the Working Center's kind of got this interconnected community of community supports, and really focuses on filling gaps in community services, looking for spaces that need to be filled, and then filling them. So here's some of that: employment services, Job Search Resource Center, St. John's Kitchen. I mean, at this time they're doing 600 plus daily meals. Now they're doing a primarily takeout style, so they're producing meals for shelters and in a huge way. Supportive housing. They have a residence at University Avenue that's got 80 residential units in it. Outreach and support services, access to healthcare. And all centered around downtown. So I really like this image of kind of like a village. You hear that it takes a village kind of mentality, and the Working Center's done really amazing work at building this kind of community that functions within the city and engages a lot of people in it. We don't need to go through all this. But the garden then, is centered around ecological food production, engaging with the ideas of agroecology practically, from soil ecology and all that goes into that, and all the way up to kind of thinking about those community supports and ways in which we can build our little food system, you know, more sustainably and engage with those ideas as well. So we're very much centered on that kind of hands-on cooperative work, knowledge sharing that generates a social good beyond just the food that we produce. So here's the garden. Let's see. I mean, I think what I can say here before I pass it off to Angie is yeah, I mean, centered around, you know, we're centered on growing food, but and I kind of mentioned this, I guess, that's almost secondary to the knowledge generation and learning. We work really hard to grow the food and to engage people in that work. And it's hard to kind of measure those pieces, you know, how many, you know, we try to have an idea of how many people come through the garden each year volunteering. We do internships. We have been able to hire seasonal staff. We have been able to engage, you know, over the last 10 years, thousands of volunteers in that work. And, you know, the ripples out from that space are not super visible to us, but we know that it's a good spot and it's doing a lot. Oh, I had something that I want to say, but I lost it. Lots of volunteers, internships, staff. Yeah, so we do 165 CSA members per year. Our shares tend to be a bit smaller, so it's not, you know, I think Angie said something like 300 she's got. It's not directly transferable. Our shares are significantly smaller than hers. And that's kind of where we work. You know, it's an interesting conversation we have every winter where we say, should we make the shares bigger? So there's interesting questions about accessibility. Our share, you can get a small share from us for $300. So that's about 15 bucks a week, you know, which is a little more accessible to people. Well, at the same time, our clientele are predominantly, you know, middle class people. They're not necessarily those that are, you know, needing, you know, a break on their grocery bills, but at the same time, you know, the value that we generate from those sales is about enough to sustain us financially. The discussion turned a little bit more towards kind of a pay what you choose model. So we offer a base price at $15, which would be comparable to like a wholesale value of the vegetables that are included in that share. And then we just offered people the option to pay more if they want to. So of those 165, I think, you know, roughly 20% chose to pay like a full retail value of those shares, which is an interesting way that we have worked to balance that kind of affordability piece, thinking about access, questioning who are we serving, and you know, trying to think through those questions in practical ways, which are not always, don't always lead to simple and easy solutions. We do invite people to let us know if they can't afford our base price, and then we enter into conversation with them about what an affordable price would be. And we're very lucky, you know, to have the financial backing of the working center and a lot of community supports in place that allow us to charge less as appropriate. We also, you know, what enters into it is also thinking about other farmers and not wanting to undercut them and to devalue the work that they're doing by offering lower prices. So it's this kind of delicate dance, and I could go into this much longer. Yeah, so we've got a really great group of people each year out working in the garden. We do, here's our shares, what they kind of look like, a small on the right and a large on the left. And we just have a lot of fun and grow a lot of food and try our hands at lots of different things. So, I mean, I think I'll just close, maybe just talk. I'm trying to just give you guys a picture of how the garden fits into the working center a little bit. The difficulty more recently has been COVID. You know, by necessity, we have to close a great number of the community tools projects. The garden, because it's outdoors, was able to remain open throughout that, but the bike shop just recently reopened. So we're starting slowly kind of coming out of this the resources that had been going into the community tools projects when COVID hit were all, you know, had to be diverted to emergency needs, shelter and food being and addiction supports being really vital to the downtown community. So it's been an interesting kind of lesson for me personally in trying to understand, think about the future that I want to see, and a sustainable food system, engaging people. But when crisis hits, it's amazing how quickly resources can be diverted away from kind of what you might call more, I don't want to call it frivolous, but it has to go to the food, shelter, so it's kind of been an interesting microcosm for me to be a part of and to try to understand the ways society responds to such great need, while still wanting to have all the things that make life, you know, wonderful, like working outside or having a good conversation around the picnic table. So that's an interesting question, an interesting, you know, kind of learning for me the last few years. So I don't know, I hope that's pretty good. If there were questions, I didn't see them, but
I have a question for you, Adam.
sure.
I'm curious about your volunteers. What kind of demographic are they coming from? Are they people that also are users of your programs? Because I was just curious, because it's a lot of education that you're offering when you're doing volunteering to learn about agriculture and those sorts of things. But I also understand that the users of a lot of your programs may not have the extra time to volunteer to do something that may not bring in any income. But yeah, I was just curious as where did they come from? Are they students or yeah?
I mean, they do run the gamut. We get a fair number of retired folks. We get a fair number of people. I mean, I love high school students, at least the keener ones. I like signing those 40-hour things. A lot of students, depending on the time of year. Things have shifted a little bit the last 2 years, but yeah, it's kind of just it's just a good kind of mix to talk about income and barriers to involve. Like, there's a lot of barriers to volunteering, like for sure, and we work to try to limit those. Some of our volunteers get paid, you know. Yeah, so there's kind of like a full, I don't know how to describe it, but I'd say predominantly we're seeing young people, kind of the, you know, 18 to 25 range. We're seeing a fair number of young professionals. I think people stuck at home in front of the computer are increasingly wanting to come out. We're getting we do get a lot of people. I don't know the language to use. We're always a bit conscious about how we describe people, but we do get a fair number of people who might be on different social supports, or maybe coming from other working center projects. We have a fair number of new immigrants who may not be eligible to work, and a few years ago, when there was a large influx of Syrian refugees, we had a lot of agricultural workers coming and wanting to practice their agriculture specific English was like a big thing for a while. Yeah, so I mean, I think we talk about it as an open space, but yeah, there still are a lot of barriers to people being involved.
I just wanted to say that that's a really inclusive manner in which you approach it. And I really appreciate the incentive that those who are keen, that if they wanted to volunteer but can't afford to, that you're able to find some middle ground where maybe you're paying them some. And I think that that's fantastic, because if you were to advertise it, you would get a different crowd looking to work in that field or work in this type of agriculture that you're doing. And by seeking those who are already keen to want to do it, and we've had previous speakers that if you want something to get done in this field, it's easier just to feed the people that are hungry for it, And I think that that's a really interesting angle, and I really appreciate that. And I kind of feel like policy or other volunteer programs should have that type of inclusive nature, because there's a lot to learn and a lot to spread from what you're doing, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I mean, what makes us, I mean, we're so lucky that we have the capacity and the space. Like, we have this year we had 3 staff and 4 interns, 3 interns, and like, that's huge capacity on an acre and a half. Like, oh my gosh, like we have all the time in the world to dedicate to, I mean, not really, but we really are able to focus on volunteers, what brings them out, what are their interests. Are you just wanting some exercise? Do you want to learn about X, Y, or Z? Do you want to, so we have, and that's what the working center is really invested in, in the garden project, in building that capacity so that we have the space to be a teaching garden, to grow food, to grow it well, and also to engage people in the work, whether they want exercise, whether they want access to food. Some people come out and it does feel very transactional, that they come and they work for an hour and then they're on their way out. We go into the fridge. What do you want to take home today? And it has this kind of transactional nature. So yeah, so we're pretty good at meeting people where they're at, is kind of the way that we talk about it.
I think what we're going to sort of do from here in, we didn't really give you an overview of our plans, but hoping to do a bit of intro and background for both of us, and then talk a little bit about production and distribution systems and some of the things that that play into those, in terms of that sustainability plays into, and then I'll sort of comes back to a little bit more of my farm and my farm's practices after that. So we're going to bounce around a little bit between Adam and I. But yeah, I'm going to save a little bit of that for later. But I do want to give you just a little bit of an introduction to my farm, so that you know where I'm coming from. So Fertile Ground is the name of my farm, as Steffanie said, and I think we're shared here. Great. So I started up in 2008. It started as a fairly small scale farm. I've always used organic methods, was certified for a while, not certified now. Various reasons for that I can talk about. My background a little bit is that until 2007, I worked in the community development and social work field. I actually used to work at the working center and managed the gardens at the working center before they were a sort of a proper market garden. And that's what I did till about 2007. Did some background or some program in ecosystem restoration at Niagara College, and then oddly enough, after all of that, landed in running a market garden business, which may seem a little bit of a circuitous route, but I think the theme through all of it is community development and caring about the land, and that has sort of played out in various ways. Yeah, and one of the things I love is that I'm running a business, and I think that's one of the things that might be, you know, that there's some differences in the way the market garden at the working center and mine operate, because I need to make enough money off my business to have a reasonable livelihood. And that has some impact and some restrictions on what I can do, but it also offers some benefits, I think. So our focus here is really on growing fresh produce. We distribute completely locally and we grow organically. And then also just really wanting to inspire people to get excited about their food. Drawing people into their food story is really important to what we do here. And so that community piece, it sort of sits there equally in importance with the production side of things. And yet probably, you know, I always tell people in interviews when they're wanting to work here is that this is a piece of our identity that is super important and it drives us, but 90% of our time is going to go purely into food production. Because we're a business that is growing food. So that this storytelling and community building piece impacts the way we do things, but it's not like it is able to be a major focus of how we spend our time and energy, because then we would need to start looking for grants and run our business sort of differently than we do. That's a little bit of context. And then we distribute 90%, at least 85% of our income, our revenue comes in through the CSA program. We have 325 households that are a member. And what I love about this is that instead of thinking in terms of customers, we're interacting with people as members of our community. And that's really valuable. And so building a farm-centric community, I think, is really important. And so for CSA, people are, of course, paying upfront. When possible, we have workarounds, installment plans, and sliding scale and various things to make things accessible. But most people are paying upfront at the beginning of the season. They're committing for a whole season. And we have 2 vegetable seasons that we run, one from June to October, which we consider our main season. And then we also have a winter CSA where we distribute storage vegetables and some greens from our structures here, our covered structures, that runs from November until March. So people can get all but 3 months of the year worth of produce from us if they so choose. So that's a little bit of background. And like I said, I'll get into some more details about how we do things in a little bit. One of the things I wanted to get in a little bit is when we're thinking about sustainable food systems and what makes a sustainable food system, I think that there's sort of 2 important things that that often get sort of collapsed into each other that I wanted to tease apart a little bit. And one is distribution system. So when we talk about local food, what we're talking about is how the food is distributed. And this is a really important part of building a sustainable food system, is that it's locally based. And another then is the production system. So how are you producing the food? Is it conventional, organic, regenerative, ecological? There's all sorts of production models. You have a monocropping system, a diversified system. And these things, there's correlation between the two, but in the end, they're completely different things. There's distribution, how do you get the food to people? What does that system look like? And the other is production, how are you growing the food? Yeah, so I mean, basically organic, if you're going to be a certified organic producer, there's some rules associated with that. So one is what sorts of products you can use. Generally, you can't use synthetic pesticides or herbicides, but there are some natural products that are allowed. You need to use cover cropping practices to protect against erosion and nutrient runoff. Not allowed to use genetically modified seed or products built on that seed, on those plants. Animals have to be given access to the outdoors and be given feed that has been grown organically. There can't be antibiotics and hormones in the meat. And there's a lot of general guidelines around things that you can and can't do to protect and build the health of the soil and the water and the broader ecosystems. Adam's going to talk a little bit more about some of the production systems in a bit. So I'm gonna skip over that fairly quickly and talk a little bit more about distribution. So now this is a really old statistic from a Food Systems Roundtable Waterloo Region report that I think is probably 10 years old now. And I would be shocked if the number has changed significantly. So you can think to yourself, because I know that Zoom isn't conducive to spitting out answers, but if I want you to just sort of make a mental guess about the average number of kilometers that on average, the 58 most commonly eaten foods in Waterloo Region travel to get from where they're grown to here. Just think for a moment. You can throw something in the chat if you want to, but so here's our number, almost 5,000. And so that's quite a distance. And this isn't all food, right? This is the food that we eat most commonly in the region. So probably you would intuitively argue that this doesn't seem very local. But what is local? What is local food? Do you go with the 100-mile diet? Some people think about that. Do you think in terms of our province? Is anything grown in Ontario local? That's a pretty reasonable way to think about it. It is only things that are grown in Waterloo Region that you would actually consider local. There's, you know, they're all reasonable ways to think about local. When I use the word local, what I really mean, the distance traveled, I think, is maybe a little bit less important. As long as you know what you're talking about, it's fine. But I would say that when I use the word local, what I mean is food that is distributed and consumed local to the farm that it was grown on. So this doesn't just mean that the farm is local to you, because if you go out into Waterloo Region landscape and you knock on the door of a farm, please don't do that, people don't love it. But you drive past a farm and you take a look at it and you say, oh, well, this is a local farm. But actually what this might be is a farm that's growing, it's growing corn, which is sent away to a processor and gets made into feed that gets shipped all across the country. So I wouldn't consider that a local farm, because although the farm is in our geographic region, their distribution is far greater. Or you might go to the Holland Marsh, this is in Ontario, and say, well, this is a local farm. And it might be, except that some of those farms will sell mostly to the Toronto Food Terminal, which will distribute within Ontario. So that I would say maybe is a local farm, but many of them may also distribute to the US. They may be, wineries in Niagara are exporting their product to Europe, believe it or not. So that's where I would sort of draw the line between what a local farm is and what a, well, not a local farm is where does the food that's being consumed end up, and is it local to the farm itself? So now this sounds pretty straightforward, but I wanted to dig into a few things here. So it still gets a little bit tricky to really think through what local means. So with fresh fruits and vegetables, you can mostly probably think about the geographic distance that things have traveled. And that is fairly straightforward. With meats, for example, so another farm product, it gets a little bit more confusing because what does local beef mean? So you could see a farm in Waterloo Region that has beef and that sells beef locally, but over half of the beef cattle that are raised in Ontario are born and started in feedlots in Alberta. And then they're put on trains or trucks and they're shipped to Ontario. And then they go to a stockyard where a grower picks them up and fattens them on their land. Now that farmer may continue through and finish them until they're ready to be processed Or they might just keep them to a certain weight and then take them back to a stockyard and sell them again to a finisher who may or may not still be in this region. And then the finished cattle once again go to the stockyards, and then they're sold to a butcher. And then the butcher is going to package and distribute the beef to markets. So at what point along that journey would you say you need to start in order for beef to be locally? Does it need to have been born here? That would be a hard line. Or does it just need to have been raised here for most of its life? Or is it important that it was butchered and distributed here? And again, I mean, I'm not suggesting that there's 100% right or wrong answers, but the idea of local, when you put it in the context of how the entire food system works, starts to get a little bit more complicated. And you could complicate vegetables as well by saying, well, where did the seed come from? I don't buy most of my seed that's regionally produced. I wish I could, but there aren't really seed houses in Ontario that are large enough to supply an operation my size with seed that doesn't come in tiny little garden packages that I would need to buy literally 10,000 of in order to grow enough for my CSA markets. So I'm buying in from the States, and those seed houses in the States, even the ones that produce a lot of their own seed, and most of them don't, most of them just buy in from elsewhere, their seeds coming from all over the world. And there's good reasons for that, because there are some regions that don't produce seed well because of climate for certain crops, but some of it is also just the way our system works. Yeah, I guess, you know, that's just kind of throwing out there some things to consider. And maybe in navigating all of this, I think one thing that I would suggest is that there's a certain correlation between size of farm, so scale, and both aspects of food sustainability. So that's both our growing practices, be it organic or regenerative or conventional, and our distribution practices. And that's to sort of postulate that smaller farms tend to be managed by families who live on site, who are actually members of the local community and have some sort of inherent investment in and motivation to care for the health of the food and the land that they steward, as well as having some inherent connections with the community around them, because humans don't really exist in isolation. And the larger the farm, the less likely it is that the people who are running it are really truly members of a local community. You know, at the far end of the scale, we have agribusiness, where the people who are running it might exist internationally and then have all sorts of farms and distribution factories and production facilities that operate all over the place. Or maybe it is even just Canada-wide, national or provincial, but the larger the farm, the more likely it is that sort of the geography that's covered is spread out, and the less likely it is that there's sort of that inherent community connectedness. So I wanted to just sort of talk a little bit about what I see as being the sustainability benefits of having truly local farms, and ideally local farms that also have beneficial production practices, but even just being local. So one is small farm viability. So we're looking at some economic benefits here. So when you've got a small enough farm that they're able to distribute locally, there's the capacity for farmers to sell their goods at retail rather than wholesale prices. So this is a higher price point, and it provides farmer with a bit of a more stable market because of direct marketing being possible. It also provides some, even if a farm is wholesaling smaller scale locally, it provides some buffering from global food price fluctuations. We're never completely in isolation from that, but the more regional you are, the more you are buffered from some of that. Strengthening rural communities is really important. And I mean, there's a bleed from rural families are sort of falling apart in some ways in Ontario. If farms aren't viable, children don't stay on the farms, they move to the city, and we end up with this loss of knowledge, and we end up with maybe children want to farm, but it's not viable. They can't stay. So building our rural communities is really important, and having viable farm operations is part of that. Circulating currency locally is an economic benefit for strengthening local resilience and sustainability, and being able to develop local business partnerships, which is part of that. That's how the money gets circulated locally. Yeah, so like for my business, for example, 90% of the money that is spent locally. It's going out as wages to people who live here. It's going out to other farms whose product we buy in. It's going out to local businesses that operate in the community. And that's not to say that, I mean, some of that's going to Canadian Tire, and that money's not 100% staying in the community, but we're not shipping things in from all over the world, because we're not at a big enough scale to support that. So some social benefits in terms of social sustainability, building of rural and urban relationships is tough. And I think it's getting tougher. We see some of that, especially in the United States. There's political divides that are really being strengthened along the rural-urban divide. And the more we do to find ways to create natural connections and understanding between our rural and our urban populations, I think that the stronger our communities will be. Simply maintaining the ability to feed ourselves, basic life skill, and local farms keep some of that knowledge in the community, opportunities for meaningful interactions and partnerships. Again, so the partnerships have economic benefit, they also have social benefit. And another thing I threw out there is food safety. And again, this is scale related. When you just think of food safety stories that you've heard in the news over the past couple of years, where have they happened? They've happened on factory farms. They've happened in large processing facilities that are bringing in meat from 100 different farms, throwing it all on the same line, needing to have extreme sanitation measures because of the possibility for cross-contamination. Superbugs grow in supersized systems. So there's some social and health benefits to having things stay a little bit smaller scale and more localized. And again, this sort of natural local investment, because if growers live locally, there's this motivation to invest in your own local community, which I touched on. And then ecologically, I mean, I would argue that production methods have more to do with the ecological footprint of an operation than sort of scale and distribution do, but a smaller scale operation that's distributing locally is not going to be able to monocrop, because as soon as you have only one crop, you're going to outserve your local market, because you're going to have a lot of one thing, and it can't all be consumed locally. So you're forced to look farther and wider. If you're really trying to serve a local market, what you're going to do is you're going to look for a bunch of different things that people will want to buy that will bring them to your farm, and you're going to need more than one crop to make things work. So there's a natural relationship there, and then of course there's a footprint in terms of our gas and oil use in the transportation, the long-term storage of goods that has to happen when they're traveling all over the world. They don't just like get picked up at the farm in a truck and then dropped off at a farmer's market somewhere else. Every step of the way involves refrigeration, it involves fuel. There's just all sorts of there's an ecological footprint associated with travel. And then, again, this sort of scale-based correlation with a stewardship mentality that can happen when you have a more diversified, smaller farm that's kind of embedded in a landscape and a community. So how is our time here? Maybe I'll skip this for now because we have lots of other things to cover, but these were just some examples of some of the ways that food gets distributed locally in Waterloo Region that would all fit within what I would say are local distribution models. And that's all kind of obvious. Buying clubs being things like Bailey's Local Food or Sustainable Market that are mini distributors that pull in foods from within Waterloo Region and sort of conglomerate them so that it's easier for people to access a lot of things in the same place, which is a really valuable service. And then the only thing I would add with grocers and restaurants is that a challenge that we face in having a truly local food system is that so many grocery stores where a lot of people get their food. So I'm not talking about the little grocers, which someone like me, like Legacy Greens or like a smaller food market, that I would have the capacity to sell to bigger grocery stores like Zehrs and Sobeys and Food Basics. They're buying not as one local store, but they're buying as a giant company, and they have very little ability to source things in their, like in the Waterloo location of Sobeys, for them to make a relationship with a local farmer. They can't. That's not the way their system works. And so even if there are farms that would have the capacity locally to supply a larger grocery store, the mechanisms aren't in place to make those connections possible. So what you're looking at is larger grocery stores are always looking for giant producers that can provide food for all of their stores or a large proportion of their stores. So that's a little bit of a hiccup there. So I'm going to hold there. And then I think Adam's going to talk a little bit about, if I talk mostly about distribution models, he's going to talk a little bit about some things to think about in terms of production practices and sustainability. And then we'll come back to me for a little bit to talk about some of our specific practices at Fertile Ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just for someone kind of taking a glance at what is agroecology, you kind of get a sense that it's not just about the ecology of one specific place, but you're trying to think about the ecology of the entire food system. So agricultural systems are inherently, they're human systems. They're managed by people. We're interacting with the natural world to grow food, and that includes, science. My advisor at University of Waterloo is a soil scientist. A lot of what she talks about is way over my head. Even as someone who's been a keener, very interested in soil and soil ecosystems for a long time. But agroecology would include this, this science base, but it also includes social sciences. Angie was talking about, distribution models, like the trade-offs that we make, and understanding the economics and understanding the social side of things, and understanding policy and politics, and all sorts of things. So it's kind of like agroecology is kind of this umbrella that is, the food system, from the soil ecology at a specific farm all the way up through these nested scales to broader food systems, and the way in which people eat, I suppose we could say. So, I was thinking back, like old Wendell Berry quote that eating is an agricultural act, kind of, I think, really drives that home, and you can understand your own place within an agroecosystem by engaging with some of the questions that Angie put forward, thinking about those things and where your food comes from. So there's this kind of distinction between agroecology as kind of on this like theory level, looking at social sciences and ecology and that side of thing, and then also you get into like agroecological practice, which I think is what maybe is more interesting to you guys, just that maybe you haven't had as much exposure to it. You have something you want to say, Angie?
No, I was just going to ask you, like, what's one thing that popped up on your farm this year after 10 years of doing this that you've never had to deal with before? I'm sure there's one. You can think, like we had a virus show up that consumed most of our lettuces for 5 of our succession plantings of the season, that I have never seen before, and I have no idea how to cope with. and we had a new pest show up, Swede midge, that decimated an entire kohlrabi crop. And I didn't catch it because I've never had it before. And I didn't know that the signs of it looked a lot like a disease that we have had. And then it progressed really differently. I was like, okay, well, folks, sorry, staff, we just wasted a lot of effort on these crops, but it's been almost 20 years of, well, it's been 15 years of farming, and I did not, it's all new. So, that was 2 examples for me.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's jumping to mind, but I mean, yeah, these things do jump up all the time. And even in terms of soil management, I mean, one thing that we've dealt with for a long time is soil compaction. Like our soil is just can be brutally hard. Like we can't, people make, when I have visitors from other farms, they, what are you doing? Everything with a hand spade, to plant your lettuce, we got to go out with this, and it's like, there's better ways to do it, but, our soil's compacted and you have to loosen it a little bit in order to get your plug in. And you can't just the harrow and whatnot doesn't quite cut it. But yeah, I mean, kind of thinking about the way in which, and then trying to figure out how to respond to those pests. Like you don't know what piece of the puzzle invited those pests to enter, right? You can think about your crop rotation might have faded in, the soil nutrients, you might have had an excess of one thing or a deficiency of something else that allowed that invited the virus to come in and take hold or something. There's all these, sorry, the cat is yeah, that kind of you start from a place of not knowing and try to just navigate your way through as best you can. So yeah, I mean, I'm always wary of people that have easy answers. In the farming world, there are a fair number of kind of celebrity farmers who are pitching you the next, microgreens are going to totally revolutionize your income streams or something like that, and you have to be a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of dancing around a lot of different things, but I think one of the key takeaways, and Angie kind of talked about this and it's kind of a good example, the monocropping of the field next to me here versus the diversity of the garden ecosystem so the property kind of has a lot of diversity going on. I wish there's only 10 acres of sugar bush on 200, which is a bummer. But we can think about agroecology. You're trying to focus on recycling and efficiency. You're trying to promote diversity. And those things are what build the resilience of the farming system to withstand shocks that, if you're having trouble with the animals, the vegetables, can fill in. I mean, the vegetables in the working center garden, when people say, was it a good year? And it's like, my answer is always average, because it's like, well, the tomatoes were terrible this year. We had, it was like it was just a bad year for tomatoes, but you know what? The cauliflower were amazing. And so you kind of have things that balance each other out just by having diversity. And that's working also on like a ecosystems functions kind of level as well. It's not just in the food that we grow, but also in the health of the ecosystem that supports the growing of that food. And then, I mean, the other thing that I'm just thinking of, is thinking about those kind of communities of practice. And like Angie talked a little bit about rural communities. And so it's really, it's really nice to see that our friends Nathan and Alita, drive their tractors down the road and come here and interact with that, or the way in which people kind of can come together around and share a lot of knowledge, share resources. There's 5 farmers in this area that are using one livestock tractor to get their animals to the processor. Those are kind of interesting things. And I think on a broader scale, thinking about, say, the Grand River watershed is like a local kind of bioregion. culture and food traditions really play into people's diets, and how do we build a more sustainable agriculture while you have to be thinking about that agricultural act that is eating, and also adapting diets to allow for farmers to make more sustainable decisions on their farms. So it's not simple, but certainly interesting. Oh, I see there's a question, sorry.
David, do you have a question?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to, it's a bit of a comment and a question. It seems like both you and Angie are talking a lot about the social sustainability of these practices and how that integrates in with the community. And it feels like, Adam, I'm just blown away by how many of your neighbors that you know and what they're doing, and they're sharing with you what they're doing too. And it seems like there's a lot of community on that end. And this is, a little bit personal on our end from our book. So we're trying to, for this class, we're trying to develop something, and we're trying to create a children's story. And we want the children to describe them in the beginning of the book as having a terrible relationship with food, and then using their grandparent to help bring them back into food sustainability, but not just that, but food culture and those sorts of practices. And you had mentioned that some of your it's senior citizens that come to volunteer, and that I was just wondering, what kind of other things are you doing? Because it seems like it's there. What are you doing to encourage the community to get involved in what you're doing? So it's not just the farmers, or how are you getting these families involved, or children? Because Angie, you were talking about how we're losing that generation. I was kind of thinking of it because Becky, my partner, her uncle is a farmer, and he's one of these big scale farmers, and his son moved away and works in nuclear power and all this other stuff, right? So, and I think, once you get to that scale, it's kind of boring too, because you're not dealing with people. You're not helping directly people. You're not seeing the direct benefits. You're just moving products and getting paid and going to Vegas to go to your farm shows and all of these things. And it's like, well, okay, well, what is farming? And farming seems like such a community thing. And I wanted to ask you guys, how do you build it? Because it seems like you're doing it. Or how do you encourage it, or that sort of thing? Because you have a lot of fertile ground for lots of stuff.
Can I jump in on this one, Adam? Because I haven't sort of gone through this part of my presentation at all.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll try to sort of pack some of this in, on the quick side. I'm just going to flip the way I was going to talk about things so that I can sort of get at that question a little bit more. Rather than, well, there's some of the practices stuff too that I'd love to talk about a little bit, but so hang on. So, I mean, I think what is a bit what you're talking about, David, this sort of idea of like, how do we build these farm-centric communities? And I part of my answer on this is always like, imagine yourself going to a party, back in the days when such a thing was possible, but there's music playing in one room, and there's maybe people playing games in another room, and there's things going on, but where do the conversations happen? They happen where the food is. If you're standing around the table, you've got your food in one hand, you've got your drink in the other, and this is where the conversation starts. And I think that that food is a natural community builder, and really, in order to be farms that encourage community development and connections, we need to just not get in the way of that. But it's really easy to get in the way of it. CSAs are supernatural community builders because of the way that they bring people to the same place to get their food. And I'm going to say CSAs is sort of in the classic CSA model, which is what both the Working Center and we do. Maybe not so much the sort of go online, make your customized share and have it delivered to your doorstep, which has benefits for the farm as well, but doesn't have a lot of benefits in terms of community building. So the classic, come to the CSA pickup, engage with your community. So maybe some strategies that we have here at Fertile Ground are first and foremost just using the CSA model. There's ways that we do partnerships with other surrounding farms and nonprofit organizations. We have work bees and community events that happen at the farm, or maybe not so much the past couple of years, but generally speaking, over the history of the farm. There's a community share fund that we have, I'll talk about for a moment, and there's sort of opportunities for storytelling. But so we have 2 CSA pickups, one that happens in Kitchener in a particular neighborhood that I used to live in, been in the same neighborhood for 15 years now. And 60% of the people who are members of that CSA live in that neighborhood. So there's, their kids go to the same school, they show up at the same park, and the CSA becomes a reinforcement of those natural connections, or it allows people to look familiar to each other and then have conversations at other places. We operate out of Extend a Family, which is an organization that supports adults who have various types of developmental disabilities, and so there's been opportunities to engage with some of the people who use the programs there. Yeah. Hey, look, throwback photo, Steffanie. So one of the things that this is maybe some of response directly to what you were saying, David. One of the things that parents tell me, particularly parents, about a benefit of being a member of a CSA is that their kids will show up at the CSA pickup. And so we used to have an explicit rule pre-COVID that anything that kids want to take to eat off the table at the CSA pickup, they can just eat. And it doesn't really cost me much because they don't eat that much, but it did mean that there would be kids sort of like playing catch with beets or shoving cucumbers in their mouth. And sometimes parents would say, hey, these are the only vegetables they eat all week. We get home and those cucumbers are toxic garbage. But at the CSA pickup, when they're in the context of this community and friends are around, it's cool and they eat it. Or they'll say they put vegetables on the table and the kids will look at them and say, are these Farmer Angie's carrots? And if the answer is yes, they eat them. And if the answer is no, carrots are gross. And I have had like dozens of families tell me that same story. So there is something powerful for kids in making that connection, not just the food itself, but like there's a person in their life who brings this carrot into existence as far as they know. Or maybe they enjoy coming to the farm for the CSA pickups. And they interact with the chickens and they understand where the eggs come from and they pick those chickens up and maybe they're terrified, but they have an experience that they remember. They go to the gardens and they pick their own flowers, they pick their own herbs. There's a whole story that develops for them. And this is part of what we do for community building. The world is about convenience. It's so much about convenience. And we're actually trying to slow people down. I don't want things to be epically convenient in our operation. I want people to bump up against each other. I want them to bump up against the land and have an experience with it. And if that slows them down a little bit and that's a problem, CSA, my CSA, is not for them. That's not what we excel at. It's not what we're trying to do. So we try to sort of create experiences at the farm. Sometimes we put the tractors out, the kids can climb on. Garlic planting season, we bring the bulbs of garlic along to the CSA pickup, we put them on the table, we ask people to help crack them open and help us make our seed garlic ready to plant. And again, people stand around the table, they talk to each other, we get our seed garlic cracked for free, awesome. They learn about the process of planting seed. These are really useful things. Quickly, some of the other things that we'll do to sort of create community connections is sort of these partnerships, whether that's simply buying in eggs or vegetables from other farms when we don't have enough, or when there are things that we don't grow well. Honey, maple syrup, some products we don't produce. CSA members and other community members have sometimes set up little businesses at the pickups and sold their bread or preserves or other things, fundraisers by local kids. And some other CSA add-ons from other local farms. So like whether that's flower bouquets, mushrooms, we have a local mushroom producer who will sell add-ons. So we connect them with our markets and we give people, more food in the same place. And then events, bringing people out to help to volunteer at the farm. This is challenging for us because we don't have grant money to sort of pay for a volunteer coordinator. We used to do a lot more of this. We do a lot less now because as the farm's gotten a little bit bigger, it's actually become really difficult for us to manage volunteer days. And so in theory, I wish we did more of them still. COVID over the past 2 years has added more complications. So we'll see what happens when we're through that. But there's been lots of here again. Steffanie has been out for some volunteer days at the farm. Seedling sale, running that as a community event with live music and just again making people sort of come and stay and engage. And doing some workshops and such.
Can I just ask, what's the physical access like? Do you generally for these things, do you have to drive yourself, or are you ever in locations where, like, as you were saying, you have the
Our farm is bikeable.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
I mean, that's not, we're not on a bus route. And the farm it's sort of just past Costco. So we're on the outskirts, but it'd be a pretty decent walk from Costco. The closest bus route would probably be a 20-minute walk to the farm. So we're pretty close. We're peri-urban. But we haven't had shuttle services or anything provided. And then in terms of like social accessibility or economic accessibility, we have a member share fund that CSA members are invited to donate into when they register as CSA members. And this year we had almost 12 grand donated to that fund, which blew my mind. And then created some challenges, some great challenges to solve, because in the past, what I've done is I've used that money in that fund to offer pay what you can CSA shares for people. But one of the things I've realized over the years is that the CSA model itself is not highly accessible for people who are kind of living on the cusp. If your life is a little bit chaotic or your transportation is not easy to manage or your schedule is all over the place or there's just like a lot of moving parts in your life, making it to that 3-hour window at a specific location as the only chance in a week to get your vegetables is just not great. And if your food literacy is low or your time is really tight or your food skills aren't great, being stuck with whatever a CSA throws at you might result in a lot of waste and not provide the access to the diet that people are able to actually integrate into their lifestyle. So we still this year had about half of the money donated went towards subsidizing the cost of CSA shares, but we had to come up with some other ways to sort of spend that money. And so what we did this year is we forged partnerships with some community organizations that had existing distribution models that we liked. And we distributed the food through them. So some of it went to the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank and their mobile markets, which are a really great, as far as I can tell so far, like a really great way to get food to people in their neighborhoods. They identify food deserts and people can choose what they're actually going to eat. Anishinaabe Outreach has spirit bundles that go out mostly to Indigenous households, but not entirely, once a week. Some of our produce went out that way, community fridge, and there's a couple other smaller places that things went. But this meant that basically I was able to stretch our donations by valuing the food at wholesale prices because we were moving it en masse. So it made more food get out into the community than when it just goes through the CSA shares. It meant we could move what we had lots of. And so it was actually, I didn't predict this, but it was really helpful at managing food waste. Because if I had a huge, we had a heat wave and 500 heads of lettuce came on beyond what I could use in the CSA shares. You can only give people so much lettuce, I promise you, you get trouble. And so it's, in the past, I would have just left them in the field, or we would have harvested some for the chickens, but mostly it would have just kind of, I would have said, well, I just grew compost and that's not terrible, it's good for the soil. But this year, I was able to harvest all 500 heads of those lettuce and send them to the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank because they can handle that level of distribution. CSA members got really sick of zucchini mid-season. So for 1 week, I pulled zucchini off of the CSA table and I sent it to Anishinaabe Outreach for their spirit bundles. So there were ways to manage produce that were really helpful that I didn't predict. These were just like some other community connections. the importance of, beyond just the local community, knowledge sharing and building a community with other farmers and growers and producers is really important. And so we're members of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, and we participate in the farmer-led research program, which means we're doing research on questions we have about production models on our farm that might be useful on other farms. And so that's a whole other thing. And then we partner with Seeds of Diversity Canada for some of their seed bank production. They have some beds here, and we've run some workshops on seed saving and seed growing. So those are sort of some of the examples that I would throw at you. Yeah, I think the only other thing I would maybe say a bit, because this ties to some of what Adam was talking about earlier too, is in terms of production, I think we struggle at our scale. So following the Canadian organic standard is not difficult. I don't think it's difficult. There's some extra expenses involved. There's some limitations, but they're not beyond anything that I would want to do anyways. When I think about ecological agriculture, so beyond organic, I'm thinking about feeding the soil. How do you feed the soil so that the soil feeds the crops, as opposed to just feeding the crops, which is the conventional model, right? You're just like injecting fertility. It's like a liquid diet. Not quite, but it's like living off smoothies maybe. And so what's really important in building healthy soil is doing things like cover cropping, which Adam talked about, using compost or manure instead of synthetic fertilizers, reducing tillage is huge, and this has been a massive struggle for us because we're caught at a scale between where we're heavily dependent on labor. I have 5 staff who work here seasonally, and so labor is a big investment. But we're beyond a scale where we can do everything by hand all the time. And so trying to find ways that we can reduce tillage, but without sort of going back to a very, very labor-centric, non-tractor-based model is tricky at our scale. And we've been doing some experimentation with ways that would work for us to do that. Yeah, so these are like some of the challenges for us in terms of ecological production. Labor's such an interesting thing because labor is a renewable resource in a sense, right? Like we're humans, we eat food. Food is grown by the sun, so we are fueled by the sun. That's good, right? More labor is good. When you think about how you when you do business analysis of the profitability of a business, one of the things you look at is the percentage that you spend on labor versus your total expenses or as a ratio of your total revenue. And the ideal is to get that as low as possible because labor is one of the largest, like we spend at least 10 times more on labor than any other expense line in our business. And so if you can get that down, then you have more net income. And so this sort of makes sense. You want to be efficient. You want to make good use of the productive use of all of your resources, including humans. But it's also completely at odds with wanting to provide a living wage for people who live on the farm, provide income for as long of the season as you can, so that people aren't just working for 4 months of the year; they at least have work for 7 months of the year. And so there's some tricky trade-offs in looking at that, and then some of the work that a tractor would do tends to be work that is actually quite backbreaking and really difficult for our bodies. And so outsourcing some of that to a non-renewable resource, fuel that goes in the tractor, saves our bodies and allows us to work for longer and remain healthy. So these are just some of the challenges that trade-offs, challenges, things that we bump into in trying to make decisions that are sustainable in multiple ways at the same time. Yesterday, we were bringing a big load of grip tape, this is like an irrigation system, garbage to the landfill, and we're just like shoving plastic into the back of the trailer. And I'm feeling kind of sick. How is this like an ecological farm generating all of this plastic garbage? But a reality is that plants need water, and we're on sandy soil, and no amount of mulching is going to change that. And the other option would be to install overhead irrigation, which is in metal pipes, which don't produce nearly so much waste, but it throws water up into the atmosphere that then evaporates. So then I'm pulling groundwater up and I'm throwing it up into the atmosphere and totally messing with the water system. So which is better, which is worse? I don't know. But these are some of the things that, that trade off. I'll hold there.
You have so much to share, Angie, and Adam, and I was really reluctant to cut you off, even though we're over time. So maybe we can just see if folks who are still here have any questions before we wrap up.
We didn't end up answering the employment standards question. Is the person who asked that question by email still here?
The person is not here, but we can, if you can either say it now, or because we're still recording, or if you want to follow up by email, I can forward it. I mean, I had just a couple sentences of thoughts, because clearly if someone was asking this question, they understand that the employment standards for general farm workers are shit. It's a joke to call them standards. There's no maximum hours, there's no paid breaks that are required, there's no minimum wage. There's no minimum wage. Just like no minimum wage for general farm workers, doesn't exist. There's no maximum number of hours per week, there's no holidays, I could go on. There's basically, we have the Employment Standards Act, and then we have a list of exemptions, which is almost 100% of them, that exists for general farm workers. So, I mean, so that's the context, but what I think I did talk a little bit about the importance of valuing workers. And, for me, having people come back year after year is one of the most important things for my business. Having to retrain people every single spring is exhausting. It slows, it's really difficult, but it's hard to have that retention if people are just sort of treated as the bare minimum. So we have a baseline $16 per hour wage, which is not high enough, but better than minimum. We're actually looking into becoming a living wage employer, but the baseline just went up very significantly a few days ago. So I have to do some number crunching to see if our budget can hit the new target. But I think, offering things like paid holidays and a paid morning break and a full 1 hour lunch, which is not paid, but is still a guaranteed break in the shade. Those, a 5 hour work week, Monday to Friday, which is pretty sane. Those are things that they're within a farm's capacity to do. We're able to do that. But we don't do statutory holidays pay, and we don't do overtime pay, and some of that is just because that's not the norm in the seasonal worker environment, but maybe are things that we should be doing as well. We used to have interns at our farm until about 5 years ago, and then there was more of I provide an education in exchange for labor, and I came to question the fairness of that and the level of privilege that was required in order for people to be able to access an internship. And so we changed to a 100% paid staff model, but we still really try to focus on providing educational opportunities, though there's less of a program built around that than there used to be.
Well, that's something that I've really grappled with too over the last few years, that our internship program has continued, amidst the some really tough questions coming from the farming community around the fairness of those. And I don't really have a nice clean answer for why we decided to continue our program, but I do feel really confident in that program and think that it's our interns are not paid a full wage, but they are receiving a not insignificant honorarium. And again, that accessibility piece we really focus on, and that having the capacity to spend a lot of time talking and teaching and giving people space to be slow and make mistakes. And so yeah, so it's complex, and but I
Well,
don't.
people have to learn somewhere, right? Like another way of looking at it is that if you weren't doing an internship, you might be paying to go to school and learn sustainable agriculture in a school program, and that'd be an out-of-pocket expense. And an internship, if it's a well-done internship that gives you a lot of educational experience, the farmer is paying for that. And the sort of the hourly productivity of somebody who's coming in completely green and learning everything and getting paid to do workshops and other things, certainly is, yeah. I think sometimes farms that offer internships get beat up, but there's a huge service that's being provided if it's being done well, and that gets overlooked. But there have been many, counterexamples of interns who have had, shitty experiences, haven't learned much, just were basically underpaid or unpaid free slave labor in a crappy working environment. So, it's a very unregulated area, and the whole spectrum exists.
Awesome.
I just wanted to ask you both on where your thoughts are on something like Elmira zone, where they're trying to take a sustainable agricultural perspective, but they're doing it with a heavier infrastructure costs. Do you guys know of Elmira zone, the tomatoes? Yeah, so I know that like they're going that other way, that you're saying, oh, it's harder in this area to just do one thing. And I know they don't just do one tomato, but it is just tomatoes. And like you said, they're unable to fulfill just this market. They're selling to Toronto as well, which is fairly local in that respect. But then how do you see that maybe other producers could jump in on that same sort of scale? Or is it just like what you're saying, that diversity is key in this? Because they're offering it at a year-round sort of thing because of their greenhouses and, like I said, the infrastructure and technology. But at the same time, they're using coconut husks and things that they're having to import because obviously we don't have coconuts here. So, but they're still trying to do things and then using technology to recycle half of their water and those sorts of things, whatever. So I was just wondering, how do you see that perspective in this whole dynamic of this market of all of these different food producers trying to do the same sort of idea, but at different scales? And at the same time, their customers are not your customers. Your customers are not going to pay $4.99 or $3.99 a pound for tomatoes. And for me, I treat them as precious now because I can't get a tomato without slave labor on it or whatever a year round. So I'm all right to pay a little bit more, but I eat a lot less tomato in that respect. So, but I don't think everyone does that equation. So where do you see these producers who are producing it at a much higher cost, but are trying to do the same sort of thing? Not the same thing, sorry, but in an ecological sense.
I mean, I would say simply, you've answered a lot of your own questions just in some of your thoughts there. Like the impact that it has on you as a consumer, I think is great. I think that's perfect. Tomatoes don't grow here year round naturally, but they found a niche. They're doing it with sustainability efforts in mind. Will it be perfect? No. Is my operation perfect? Hell no. So, that like, and the alternatives, if you really want to be able to get tomatoes in February, you're going to get tomatoes in February in some way, shape, or form. So having as sustainable and as local producer for that to get them from, the cost is a little bit higher, makes you eat a little bit less. You'll eat more tomatoes in August. I think that's fabulous. And that's part of, now if you blow diversity up in terms of thinking diversity at a regional scale, then they start to provide an alternative that operations like Adam's and mine don't.
Yeah, I mean, my mind started going to like the technology piece, because I do know a guy that was helping install some lighting systems in a few of Elmira's own greenhouses, and they're super efficient and and at the same time I'm sitting here going, well, in an energy constrained future, are we going to have the ability to operate those? It's great that they've got them there, but what's going to happen if the electrical grid is iffy, or there's questions like that. But I think underlying it is just kind of a fundamental distrust of technology, and maybe it's just emerging from receiving too many emails from people saying, "Oh, did you see this robot that's going to do all the weeding for you?" And it's like, that's not the point. Like I want to, you know, like I've dedicated my life to trying to engage people in the work of growing food, and so a robot's going to come and do it. Oh, great! That's just, yeah, that solves all my problems, and I can just quit. And so yeah, there's just kind of a fundamental distrust on my part, and that's just, it's a personal thing on
I think it has a lot of validity. I think that we should be cautious a lot when we accept technology and advancement into agriculture. A lot of it has been a lot of double talk, doing one and doubling it down on the other, or ruining one thing for one, you know. So I think it is very important to be slow or adapting at a way that you feel comfortable. And because I mean, you guys are obviously integrating some technology. You're not using a cow to pull your plow. So I mean, I think that it's figuring out that balance. And then, yeah, it's just interesting to hear your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Wow. We could go all day, clearly. I'm so appreciative of your time, and yeah, the richness of the picture that you've drawn for us on what farming is and can do, does for community. And you know, I've said this to most of our speakers, like there's just you've encapsulated the whole course in one guest lecture in terms of all these different dimensions that you've been underscoring for us. So appreciate it, and I'm glad that we're able to share this out further.